Okay. Anyway, I work for a company called MX. We make personal finance technology. We're pretty dope. Why the hell did this happen? Hold on. All right. I swear I got this. Been working for them for almost 2 years now, which has been pretty awesome. Before that, though, before I became a programmer, before I went through DevPoint and all that, I was actually a journalist, believe it or not. I was a reporter for the Deseret News. I'm sure all of you are just devout readers of the Deseret News, right? You all look like it. I'm kidding, they're all 80-year-olds. So I worked for the Deseret News, and I mostly covered things like business, technology, startups, personal finance, public finance, basically anything that involved money I covered. I ran this little section right here called MoneyWise. I ran that for a little while. So I did a lot of writing. And I remember one time I did this story. Hey guys, what's up? Come on in. I did this story. And in this story, I thought I would be just, you know, such a cool reporter, like someone at The Economist or, you know, something like that. And I was going to include a word. Has anyone ever heard this word before? Raise your hand if you've actually heard this word. 2 people, maybe 3, 4. Don't just follow everyone else. If you haven't heard it, you haven't heard it.
I have not heard that.
You have not heard that word. A lot of people have it. You probably have heard it, but you don't hear it often, right? And there's probably a good reason why you don't hear it often, right? Probably because it's a really confusing word, and a majority of people probably have never even heard it. Well, I used it in this story. It's a story. It's a story about how these Utah County cities and businesses sued the Timpanogos Special Service District because of a compost heap. So literally, this story was shit. It was about shit. So that was the story. I wrote this story, and I thought it was so cool because they gave me an exclusive on it, which was pretty dope. And I included this word. I said, and then I tried to give it to my editor, right? I was like, here you go. You know, try this one on, right? And the second he read that word, he didn't even put it in a note. He just looked over at me and said, no way. No, nice try, right? And I'm like, no! I worked so hard on this word that was not invented by me, but you get what I'm saying. I worked hard on this, and it was a word that and the reason why he rejected it is because of a journalism rule of thumb. The point of journalism is to take all this information, and yeah, regardless of your opinions of journalists, I don't want to hear it. But what journalists are supposed to do is gather all this information, and it usually is really complicated and all over the place, and they synthesize it down, and they make it as simple as absolutely possible. So it's actually taught in college that you're supposed to write at an 8th grade reading level. And the word putrescence is not an 8th grade reading level, right? It is far from 8th grade. And so why is it that journalists are trying to write at such a low reading level? Well, reading's hard. Let's be honest. It's kind of hard. But really, the reason is because, ideally, the information that you're gathering as a journalist is so important that you want as many people as possible to understand it. There's a lot of, journalism is ideally a very romantic line of work. We're trying to fight for the people, and it ends up not being so much. But in a lot of ways it is. And so the information that we had, we were trying to make it as easy to read and easy to understand as absolutely possible. And we didn't want to dumb it down to a kid's book, so the sweet spot ended up being 8th grade reading level. Well, granted, we got some kids doing TED Talks, like this kid, who thinks she's better than me, apparently. But we have kids doing TED Talks, and yeah, they're pretty smart, but ultimately people are people, and they do people things, and you have to account for people. Like this, my favorite is that guy doesn't, and here comes the RAM, like, I'm not done here, right? But ultimately, yeah, people are people, and you have to take into account that not everyone is going to understand at the same level. While in the journalism world, they figured, okay, well, yeah, we can't account for everyone, right? But you can't account for everyone's aptitude. So what you can do is, hit a sweet spot where you're not being too condescending, but you're at the same time, you're also accounting for people who may not necessarily understand right away. So how does this relate to documentation? Well, documentation is very similar, right? You have created something, like let's say you create a gym, and that gym happens to be a little complicated, well, and you're going to need to write some documentation. The reason why you're writing documentation is so people know how to use your piece of technology, right? That's the reason you're doing it. And so when you do that, you're ideally taking the information or taking how to use your gem or piece of code or even like a full-on DSL like RSpec, right? RSpec's nuts sometimes, right? Well, and their relish isn't always the best, but it's actually pretty verbose. And so they did a great job making that very easy to understand. What you're probably saying to yourself is, hey, Joey, I'm not a writer, right? And it's true, you're not a professional writer, otherwise you'd be writing professionally, right? Well, you do write professionally, you just write code instead of, and this guy, I feel like this guy lost the Super Bowl. He's just bummed out, right? This is a press interview and he's just holding back the tears. But yes, you're not a writer, but there are things you can do to improve that documentation, to make it a little easier to understand. Another thing you're probably asking is, why? Why would I even do that? Well, as you know, and as I can attest to, there are lots of people in the programming world right now who have decided to become programmers, who have decided that barriers have dropped enough to where they feel comfortable enough to enter a very complicated world, right? And as simple as Ruby or other languages that other abstracted languages make the learning process, as easy as that is, you still have a lot of barriers, and I honestly believe that documentation is one of those huge barriers. I've talked to, people who are new to MX, for example, and our documentation, I'll tell you, isn't amazing by any stretch. And I'll have to come by and explain some of these more complicated systems. And of any company I've seen, some of our systems are crazy, and they definitely need good, solid documentation. And I'm working to improve that. So the ramp up, you can imagine what the ramp up time is for an employee coming to a very complex code base with no good documentation. Well, imagine what that's like for someone who's trying to learn Ruby or trying to learn mobile programming. They come to your gem or your code snippets, or even perhaps an entire application you've written, and they have no idea where to begin. They don't even know where the mouth of the gem is, where the core of the gem is, simple implementations of the gem. And it's all because the documentation isn't clear or it's vague, and so on. So what I'm going to talk about today isn't just, shame on you for writing bad documentation. Maybe you read good documentation. What I can tell you for sure is how you can write good documentation, because I honestly believe that documentation writing is no different than any form of informative writing. You're taking complex ideas, synthesizing them down to simple points, and putting them out there so that people can understand your code, right? So the first, and in some ways the most important tip I would give you is don't use jargon. Now, jargon is a tricky word in programming because there are a lot of things in programming we have to describe with words that aren't typically associated with computers. The simplest word is bug. Well, there's no actual bugs, even though that's where that word came from. There's no actual bugs inside a computer, right? But we use that term, we use that word to describe something. Granted, the general public tends to know what a bug is. We have bugs in our program or our apps, and we report those, right? But what about other words that perhaps people don't get? Some words that are actual computer science terms, other words that are just straight up jargon. Things like these. These are a few that just came to mind when I was writing this. Scalable, abstraction, arity, mutable, code smell. All of these words I had to like pretend it. Like people would say this to me at work and I had to just pretend like yeah, that's totally a code smell. I totally get that. And I did it, I had no freaking clue. Arity, that was my most annoying one. To me, I actually got frustrated with this one. Does anyone know what this means? Okay. Does anyone else know what this means? Well, what is it? Tell us.
The number of arguments that a function
yeah.
or something.
So if a function has, or a function, or in the case of Ruby, if a method has arguments, that means that method has arity. And you can talk about the level of arity that a function has. You wouldn't obviously want too much arity. And so that's a term that I heard used at work and kind of blew me away. I'm like, I don't even know what this word means, right? And so I couldn't, I just skipped over, it was the title of a pull request. I just skipped it because I was like, obviously over my head, when really it actually was totally not over my head. It was just changing the way we did arguments in a certain class. That's it. That's all it was. Really simple. But it steered me away. I said, no, I don't want to do this crazy thing because it's got this weird computer science word. Now, a word like arity is a computer science term. It's actually a mathematical term. You can also just say arguments, like how many arguments, are in a function or a method. And it doesn't take a whole lot more time. Like I wonder what the people who say arity instead of, arguments do with all their spare time, right? Because it's like, it's not super hard to elaborate just a little more. And that's the point I want to make about jargon. A lot of times we do have to use these words as shortcuts, especially as people who are experienced programmers. When it comes to writing documentation, especially on some place like GitHub where it's public, it might not hurt to elaborate just a little more. Some of them are just flat out jargon, like code smell. Code smell is just flat out, it's kind of just jargon, which is fine. It can be used amongst other programmers, but newer programmers might not really know what a code smell is. Do any new programmers not know what that is? Got a couple here. A code smell is just basically when when a line of code is probably an indication of a greater problem. Like it's a code smell, like something smells funny here. Or something like mutable. Mutable isn't, and that mutable I want to talk about specifically again, because the word mutable is one that you can't really get away from. Like that is a computer science term that we kind of have to use. So my suggestion is, if you feel like you need to use a computer science term like mutable or arity or an abstraction, right? Every one of these words, every one of those words has a Wikipedia page. Just take a quick second, and I know it is a little annoying, but take a quick second and just link to a wiki page that explains what that is. You would help out the greater community by saying, hey, some of you may not understand this word because you're new, so why not take a look at this page and understand what an immutable and mutable object is, right? The difference between mutable and immutable, right? I think that would help out the greater community, and that's kind of what we do as Rubyists. So yeah. Show, don't tell. If you've got a pogo game, you should show it. You should not tell it. Yeah, that dude. Yeah, but hey, he showed, right? he's doing it. So what I mean by show don't tell is you can I'm gonna have to move that slide, aren't I? Yeah, okay. You guys. With show don't tell, like you can talk about what your code does all you want, but obviously you're not going to be able to really show what, you're not really going to be able to get across what your code does until you actually show it in action. Now, a lot of people do this already. I don't know of a majorly contributed open source project that doesn't have examples, code examples of how to use. Some even have full-on live applications that are implementing that code, which is awesome, right? You can download you could clone down their app from GitHub and just look at how they did it, which is really pretty cool. But a word of warning when it comes to showing your code and instead of just telling. You definitely should do this, but when you do it, try not to get too complicated with it, right? Don't write a ton of crazy code that is superfluous to what your code actually does, right? Keep it nice and simple. Another thing too is don't make it too simple to where it's vague, right? For example, if your gem is a Rails gem and it requires you to initialize something, initialize some kind of environmental variable or something like that, don't just say slap this line of code somewhere, right? Okay, that's good, but those who are somewhat new to Rails will understand exactly where to put that. I remember that experience myself where I'll find a gem and it'll say, okay, you need to initialize this. It's like, where? It didn't dawn on me that I could just write my own initializer and slap it in there. So why not just say, here's what I did. I just created this file in the initializer folder and threw it in there, right? That's a quick and dirty thing you can do, and that's how I did it, right? And that's something real small you can do to kind of help the greater community understand how to implement some of this code, right? I actually ripped the example off Devise, which I love their documentation for two reasons. One, because they actually aggregate articles written about their gem, which is pretty cool. They say, hey, have you written an article for us or want to write an article for us? Let us know and we'll make sure to publish it. Make sure people know that this is out there. So they almost crowdsource their documentation, which is pretty awesome. But also because I see a lot of this, and this could be just more about the individual who wrote this. But this person used a great deal of comments. Like, I'm going to comment this line out and not just say somewhere else that it's optional, but I'm going to put a comment here that says only if you're using reconfirmable right here. So put that in there. Also, they'll write this line right here, which is just straight SQL, which is pretty cool. But people who aren't super familiar with SQL queries and writing their own SQL queries, they won't really know exactly what this is doing. So if you were to just throw this in here without really saying anything, they probably wouldn't know what that's really doing. So this person did a really good job of saying, hey, this is what this is going to do. All existing user accounts will now be able to log in after this because you're setting the confirmed at to the current time. So, yeah, use those comments to your advantage. Normally, I promote self-commenting code. Your code should comment itself at your work. So, go out, go to work, and write some self-commenting code, discoverable code. That's awesome. But when it comes to documentation, I feel like the code snippets you write should be both self-commenting and also actually commented. It doesn't hurt to be overly verbose about this because then people can understand a lot better when both your code and the intention of your code is very clear, okay? Finally, and this is actually a really fun one. explain your code to your grandma, kind of like you would have to explain Pokemon Go to your grandma. This grandma is not satisfied with Pokemon Go at all. I've watched this for, I swear, an hour. Go get that gas leak just out of here. That was actually a rule of thumb I used as a journalist. When I wrote the story, a lot of times I would have an editor hand it back to me and kind of just slide it back to me and say, this is too complicated. Could you read this to your grandma and have her understand it? And I'd be like, oh, damn. And what's funny is in Deseret News, it probably is your grandma. I mean, so I had to get really good at it. But this is a good way. I mean, yeah, we're dealing with programming. And inherently, programming is going to be a little complicated, right? So there is like, you don't have to completely and utterly dumb it down. But if you can take what your code does and explain it to your grandma or your mom or whoever, someone who isn't very familiar with programming, then you probably have nailed it. And no, you don't have to write like this the entire time you're writing documentation. But if you can do this, this is probably what you should lead with. Because then it's very clear right up front what your code does and why it exists, what problem it solves, okay? So yeah, I think that this is actually an awesome rule of thumb. See if you can't take what your code does, synthesize it down so simply that even your grandma would understand it. So documentation, the whole point of this presentation is to address something that I'm very passionate about, which is helping people participate in programming more, right? It's a lot like I used to be a photographer quite a bit. I would take photos of my own stories and blah, blah, blah. And studied it in college and everything. And it would always frustrate me that people would just like go out and buy SLRs and they would just participate, right? Well, yeah, I mean, there is some frustration there, right? You do get kind of, shitty photos on Flickr from people who went and bought a camera at Costco. But at the same time, there is something beautiful about the democratization of photography. The same thing goes for programming. There's something beautiful about the democratization of programming. People now can participate in this, whereas before they could not. And so you get people who are going to bring fresh ideas to our community. People who are going to bring a different perspective to the community. People who were journalists or construction workers or firefighters, all kinds of different lines of work I've heard of, people just giving it up to learn programming. And I honestly believe that all programming communities can benefit from being a little more helpful for those folks. And the Ruby community is already amazingly helpful, but the documentation to me is still a little confusing. So I think if we make what we do a little clearer, make it a little more easy to understand, avoiding that jargon, making sure that we show clearly what our code does, and being able to explain it in the simplest ways possible, I think we can tear down those barriers, those professional walls that can be erected due to confusing documentation. So I hope you all can go out and, when you write your code, when you publish your gems on Ruby Gems, that you can have very clear documentation to where anyone can use it, brand new dev point people can use it, or even the oldest of programmers can use it. So thank you all. I can answer a few questions myself. Yeah. So you want to have any questions for me? Yeah. I debated on that actually, and I'm hesitant to call anything out in particular. I'll say that the Ruby community actually does tend to have better documentation, whereas I've had to sift through Java documentation, which is not awesome, I'll say. I would say, I know one situation that I recently came across where I maintain a system that's outside of our system, and the point of that it's hosted on AWS, and we do that intentionally because we deal with banks, and I created a fake bank outside of our system that we use as a testing platform. I had a somewhat younger, I almost said reporter, somewhat younger programmer than myself. She was helping me implement Sidekick. So I said, okay, we're going to need a Redis instance. And when I said that, she's the go-getter, and she went out and started reading Redis documentation, which I think frustrated the crap out of her. And I started sifting through it, and yeah, I mean, for someone a little more experienced, it did somewhat make sense, but I could see where the frustration would lie. I don't have specific examples, but it's usually, when I see bad documentation, it's usually, it makes assumptions about the readers, which in some ways you can, I think, because whoever's coming to, obviously, you know, I looked up a gem recently that that helps you implement a bloom filter. And most people who use bloom filters know exactly what they're doing, right? So you kind of do need to know your audience as well. Something like authentication with OAuth, that's like almost the first thing that new programmers want to do, right? Is they want to build their new app with authentication. So you also do need to know your audience. If you created this bloom filter was like Ruby gem to create a bloom filter. To me, that was actually pretty sufficient, because if anyone's coming to that gem, they're going to say, you know, they probably know what a bloom filter is and what they're doing, right? Granted, they need to know how to use your namespace, like they need to know how to implement your namespaces and things like that. They need to know how to tie it in. But otherwise, it's pretty, people are going to know, right? But if it's something that's so commonly used or something like that, and it tends to be vague, or it assumes that the reader understands everything about programming, that's when it tends to start getting a little confusing for some people. So, yeah.
If you've ever received documentation in the form of a Word doc, that's bad documentation.
I also will say that for general method by method referencing, RDocs is great, but RDocs is not sufficient. So don't just say, the RDocs is good. Make sure that unless you're helping to write those RDocs, don't just rely on definitions inside of RDocs to cover it. So
I'm curious because you have a unique perspective with your journalism experience. Is there anything there that you would suggest as something that could improve technology writing generally, like maybe inverse pyramid or anything? Inverse pyramid, like starting with the most important stuff.
Yes.
In the first paragraph. Or
yeah. Like code, you mean?
Well, in your document, as you're writing documentation.
Well, obviously you should lead with what your code does. And that's why I think if you can explain it to your grandma, you take that grandma explanation, that's what we would call, in journalism terms, we'd call that a nut graph or a lead. You just slam somebody right off the bat with the most important information. This is what my code does. This is the problem that it solves. Give us the who, what, where, when, why, right? And hit us with it right off the bat. So yeah, it is a very inverted pyramid style where you give us the most important information first, and then from that point on, you at the very bottom of the docs, you can say, hey, here's a cool trick you can try. Not necessarily crucial to the implementation of your gem, but maybe something cool that you want to do, or maybe here's a different implementation of my gem.
Here's a weird niche use case.
Yeah, here's someone in Devise, here's someone who
you have to do it without internet access.
Or Devise does this thing where at the very bottom they're here's how to override the sessions controller if you need to do that. I'd say most cases of Devise, for people who are just using Devise right out of the box, they don't need to know that right off the bat, right? So I think I saw one more.
So I've been reading this book called Dead Point for Me.
Okay.
And there they say, it's pretty funny actually, when they say like, documentation is like deodorant for code smells, because your code should be
Self-commenting. Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Well, why not both, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
I felt it was a little bit too fundamentalist.
I think that is too, and I think fundamentalism like that is contrary to this idea that people can come and be programmers. I think that that's a big problem in programming communities. Is you have fundamentalists who say, yeah, no, we're not writing better docs because code should be understandable. It's like, no, that's not, no. And so I think that there are some fundamentals that we do need to keep. If you become a Rubyist, you do need to learn what the word arity means. You do need to learn what a code smell is, right? You don't need to just be lazy and expect everyone else to coddle you. But at the same time, like, I mean, I think I smell great, but I still wear deodorant, damn. So, but you get what I'm saying, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you can have both. Like, and that's like, I swear, I've never seen such scrutiny on self-commenting code, on discoverability, as we call it. We use RuboCop. I have very strong opinions about RuboCop, but RuboCop, we even have written our own rules inside of RuboCop to enforce very strict, like we are not allowed to use single letter variables ever. If I'll get scrutinized if the variable I declared is not descriptive enough, and I think that that's very important. But at the same time, does that mean that our code and should not be documented well? No, I think that you can have both. So,
I wanted to add a point to that. I think one of the big things that people don't understand is like, I actually hate RDoc and YardDocs and all that stuff because it's kind of like, that stuff's good if you're trying to read a dictionary. You know what I mean? But it's good if you're reading through like the assembly guide that can't code for that. You know, like you need a lot, but you need a quick start guide to actually figure out what's happening there. One of the best projects I ever worked with that actually kind of changed my mind on documentation was actually Elasticsearch. Their documentation is fantastic.
Yeah.
It's written like a novel, not like a dictionary. The last company I worked at Access, we really took that part as we were writing documentation for our APIs. That this code has to be understandable. Our documentation has to be understandable. Technical product manager, it's not my code, you know.
Yeah.
And so, echoing that point that you made, understanding your audience is key. That's the key to any writing. It doesn't really matter. That's the key to presenting information is understanding your audience, right? On top of that, writing 101 would suggest it takes a lot of words to express something very clearly and plainly. Okay? So the more clear something is, that didn't happen on accident. The writer worked really hard to make it very clear. And that's important. You wouldn't disagree with me for a second there. Because expressing ourselves, it's easy to just type, right? If I look at my Slack conversation log versus like an email I'm writing, it's two different talking, right? It's
Gosh,
message LOL versus
my emails aren't even that bad.
Yeah, so
I get fired if it was on email.
So that's another point. Understanding your communication medium is important, right? Emojis don't really translate into email all the time like they do on IM.
But use them often.
So,
You need to be using them all the time.
but I think I want to elaborate on that a little bit though. It's commenting your code. I do agree. Your code should be simple enough that it expresses itself, and when it can't express itself, you better put comments in there explaining it for the next person who comes along. You know, if I have something that says like students equals user.find where user type equals student, I don't really need to explain that that's a lookup on student, right? Like when the code can express itself, let it, and don't worry about adding comments just for a comment to line count or whatever. You know, with that, like I said, that level, like inline commenting, that level of documentation is not meant for a new user. That's used for a maintainer of the code, somebody who's actively contributing to it. And in open source, that's never your primary first audience, right? I think that's pretty important. I don't know if you guys have similar experiences that way, but I literally got documentation for this merchant wallet system that I'm supposed to integrate with. It came in a Word doc format. 16 different methods and literally not a single sentence describing what they did. This isn't documentation. You just exported your kernel script to basically, right? Like, and bolded the name of the method call inside of it or something, right? And it takes somebody very technical who's worked with payment systems before to even work their way through that. I think the worst documentation I've ever seen is on proprietary API access to content that you're paying for, which is the complete opposite of what it should be. If you're paying for that, it better be good, right?
Well, they're trying to make money on the back end of consulting.
That's right.
I didn't even think of that. Gross.
But that's kind of the same mentality of, I gotta be careful how I say this. It's the same mentality of, I'm gonna purposely write bad code in here that nobody understands. It's good stuff, it's manual, it's so obfuscated that I'm gonna be able to get it for job security. That's that same mentality, right? I don't think that doesn't exist. It exists, you know, far more often than we see, right? But yeah, I mean, if that's your motive in life, you know, I guess that's what those guys who use fancy words are doing in their spare time, you know, consulting.
Oh yeah, I guess that's true.
Yeah, and I just want to kind of talk about that point because I've been thinking about that a little bit myself later. Yeah, any other questions or comments, experiences about documentation? Yeah.
Do you find that doing documentation makes it easier for you to sell your product?
Absolutely.
Because it gives you practice talking to people who don't have any interest in
Yeah.
products except to
Well,
get what they want.
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Here's use Twilio.
Oh,
You can literally put up your code in less than 15 seconds.
yeah.
I said, who here's used Twilio?
You know what Twilio is?
Yeah. You can literally implement their code and send a text message within 15 minutes.
Yeah,
That's
dude, their codes, they're pretty great.
They get you started for free and they grow the check you over $2,500 this month. Because their code is simple. It's the only reason I did. Twilio, right? They're telecommunications API, phone calls, voicemails, automated phone queues, things like that.
We use them for texts.
Yes.
Text alert.
Now compare that to Amazon. They have their new SMS service they're launching through their SNS site.
Simple notifications.
Yeah. The documentation's verbose, but it's not good. That's the problem with Amazon documentation, is it's verbose, but it's not good.
That's a good example of that. Yeah, I've actually done work with SNS, and that's S, you know, N, not M, but SNS and Amazon. It's really hard to implement that, to know exactly what, because they do have an API that allows you to not have to log into their dashboard to create all the things you need.
Yeah.
But it is just, it was the worst. So, yeah.
So, truthfully, we're pretty spoiled as Ruby developers. Who here's worked on mobile, iOS or Android? Ruby's here, iOS is like here, and Android's like here, as far as documentation.
Didn't know that. I didn't know that. Yeah.
And if you want to play with Ruby Motion, there's this great starter kit that's next to nothing for that too, you know? And so, mobile documentation is horrible. Why? Because it's still very proprietary. We've made pretty good money keeping it that way until recently. So there really wasn't a lot out there outside of those.
So our financial products, we don't sell them to users. We do have users on the system. We actually sell them to banks. So our clients are actually banks, and the people who we most deal with, especially our integrations team, so that they're the ones that help integrate our APIs with on the bank's end. A lot of them have said our documentation, at least for the APIs, is fantastic. And to answer your question, when documentation is really good for like APIs for your clients, they're going to tell other developers in their communities how great it is, right? And if you are notorious for great documentation, it's going to be awesome. But like what he was saying with Amazon, like if their SNS documentation is so bad, like it was really bad. It made me, like I remember helping, like I was doing it for the push notifications, so they're great for being a central place to push to any kind of system, iOS, Android, it doesn't matter. But as I was doing it, I'm like, like is there a different product we can use, because this is so frustrating, right? And what he was saying, Twilio, boom, they've got his money because it's just well documented, easy to implement, well documented. Yeah.
That's what really turned me on to payment things like Braintree, Stride, compared to Google Business, Price.net. I had that exact same experience where the documentation was horrible. They had no client libraries. They didn't. I mean, like providing good client libraries around your content is so important if you're trying to monetize your APIs at all, right? Or your services.
Yeah, wrappers like Jim, like you'll see a Ruby wrapper for Twilio.
That's right.
They've got one. Amazon has one, but they basically took everything in AWS and smashed it together into one gem. So it's not, again, a bad example. It's not great.
Google did that at first, and now you have guys like Mike Ward who's actively trying
Oh yeah,
make
that's right.
this one better as a consultant, you know. Yeah.
You guys are reading my text.
Comments?
Let me, here, I'm just gonna, do you need this?
No.
Okay, good, because I don't want people, can I kill the hangout? Or?